And as long as you have these ones, you should be in pretty good shape. You should be in pretty good shape. So a multiple choice, then jump right into the short IDs. And trust me, I'm kind of annoyed by this. I'm not saying we don't need it, but second pair is my study belt, so I didn't care if I lost that. You know, this one, I want to do you 5 minutes longer. Don't you want that? Huh? Yeah, I know, but you just be done with that PSAT. Okay, so let's go take your notes out. And we were around the War of 1812, weren't we?
So yeah.
And we got, I told you the disastrous invasion of Canada, right? Mm-hmm. All right. So, first off, just to review, after what battle did people, citizens of the United States, start referring to themselves as Americans? What's that? Tippecanoe, yes. And who is the leader of the Indian Confederacy at Tippecanoe? Who is the leader of the American forces? U.S. forces. Yeah, William Henry Harrison. War of 1812 started. What was the bill that said the United States would not trade with anybody that doesn't respect their neutrality rights? Naked's bill. Number 2. So much better than number 1. And number 3 is laughable. Number 2. And so, a couple things really quick. Even though the invasion of Canada was a disaster, who was president and became his war? Madison. Good. The USS Constitution, one of the American ships built during the Federalist Adams administration, actually did win a fight with a British ship and would become like this, one of the few bright lights of it, become the most famous ship in the U.S. Navy. Old Ironsides, because the British cannonball seemed out of its oaken hull, so it must be made of iron. And like I said before, that ship is still in the United States Navy today because of this victory here. And one more battle we have to, or 2 more battles. And then in September 1813, a U.S. fleet, small fleet, defeated a small British fleet at Lake Erie, called the Battle of Put-in Bay, or the Battle of Lake Erie. The American commander was Oliver Hazard Perry, and he would become another hero of the war. And Perry would send a message back to Washington, D.C. with the great saying, a little bit like Caesar's or Beni Vidi Vici, we came, we saw, we conquered, we have met the enemy, and they are ours. What a great line. And so, it's not that the British would be totally routed, but this was important because everybody knew that when the treaty negotiations do come, it's whoever holds the best position gets the best deal. And there would be one relatively minor American victory, but it had great consequence. It was in Canadian territory. It was more than anything else a raid by William Henry Harrison called the Battle of the Thames. That happened a month after Put-in Bay, after Lake Erie. And here, a small American force fought a small British force and the remnants of Tecumseh's Confederacy. And this is supposed to be a shot at Tecumseh dying. No one really knows how Tecumseh died. The British actually really stabbed the Tecumseh in the back. Just as right before the battle began, the British retreated and left Tecumseh's relatively small force, no more than 450 men, to face about 2,000 soldiers from the U.S. And it was a topsy-turvy battle, but in the end, Tecumseh would be mortally wounded, and with that, they fell apart, thus totally ending Tecumseh's Confederacy. And maybe to show, like, we finally defeated the feared Tecumseh, U.S. soldiers went ravaging through bodies, just trying to find, well, looting too, but trying to find Tecumseh's body. And they finally found a body, and they raised it up. This is Tecumseh, we killed him. And they carried the body around, and somebody cut the head off, and they stuck it on a bayonet. And we're carrying this head around. We defeated Tecumseh. I guess, I don't know, it was horrific, but it gets worse. Then somebody skinned Tecumseh. Okay, it probably wasn't Tecumseh. They found some poor, unfortunate man who died in the battle and said it was Tecumseh. They skinned him and then tanned the skin to make a very thin leather. And they cut strips out of his back. So strips about that long and about that thick of tanned, thin leather, and sold it back in the United States. And it soon became a big deal to have a Tecumseh leather strap. Soon there were thousands of them. No, Tecumseh was not a giant. So obviously they're skinning something else and selling that as Tecumseh leather straps. And into the 20th century, a certain type of business would advertise, we have Tecumseh leather straps. Who uses a piece of leather? You think about that wide, about that long. Piece of leather. Barbers. To get that fine edge on the razor they would shave with, they do it on a leather strap. And so barbers would advertise, we have Tecumseh leather straps into the 20th century. Yeah, I've seen one today, and it just, you know, looks like a little curled piece of thing, you know. But that's what came out of this. It also showed it was more like, we defeated them now, let's show that they're nothing but savages. Which, of course, they didn't. Obviously, they feared it. Harrison, this would be a big victory for Harrison, too. And Harrison would jump into politics after this. But in 1814, Napoleon was defeated, and the British decided, let's knock him out. Knock him out. Let's get rid of him. One fell swoop, knock him out. Now, the British wanted out of this. And so this was going to be just win some battles, and then at the negotiation table, maybe we can carve off a better deal. A four-pronged attack, a much strengthened blockade, an iron blockade. And they really blockaded New England for the first time, too. They wanted them to suffer. Next, to attack on the traditional invasion route into or out of the United States, Lake Champlain. Kind of like what happened back in the Revolutionary War. They wanted to isolate New England. They thought New England, and they were almost right, New England might secede. Next, advance up the Chesapeake and attack the capital. A small American force burnt down the Canadian colonial capital at York. Today, York is Toronto. Right here. So, just a raid, but a humiliating. It would be a humiliation for the United States if they just captured it. And lastly, take the very important harbor city of New Orleans. They might keep that. They can get it before the treaty. Basically, what it was is we hold on to it before the treaty's negotiated. We might be able to keep it, or maybe break it away. The British knew they couldn't conquer the United States. They just couldn't do that. Too big. But might be able to split it into pieces. Now, the blockade worked. The blockade was very effective. Lake Champlain, there'd be one key battle. And at Lake Champlain, a small American fleet made by a man by the name of Captain McDonald. In fact, this is what we're going to do. I'll come back and tell you what happened here. Let me get through all of this to make sure I get it all done, and I'll come back and tell you a story. Sound good? There's a couple stories I'll tell you. I'll come back to them.
I need the room for this one.
This one, all we need to know about the Battle of Lake Champlain is, shocking everybody, a small American fleet defeated a British fleet. And with that, the British decided we can't invade without controlling Lake Champlain, which is true. They remember what happened at Saratoga back in 1777. So that one failed, but that was never more. I mean, it was going to be an attack. Who knows? Maybe New England might break off, but the Chesapeake would be a lot different. At the Chesapeake, the plan was for the British. Okay, this map is from the West Point Atlas. It's online. And I know it's kind of hard to tell, but this is the Chesapeake Bay. So here's Maryland, and it has a little peninsula right here. Here's the Potomac. That's Washington, D.C. That's Baltimore. The plan was to fake an attack with the fleet up the Potomac, but land the army on the Maryland side and march overland. That was the British plan. And the Americans were totally unprepared for this. All the best soldiers the Americans had were on the Canadian border. They had some success on the Canadian border, at least holding the British out. And so they were up there, but there were no roads. There was no way they could get them back. So all the Americans had were about 5,000 poorly trained militia. And what do militia always do? So this was a problem. The British had just under 5,000 battle-hardened troops. They had fought in what's called the Peninsular Campaign, Spain, against the best France had, and won. These were good troops, and they were mad. They thought with Napoleon being defeated, they could go home. At least no more fighting. And now they're sent to this godforsaken place. They were mad. So they wanted to take it out on somebody. Well, you see this right here. It's called the Anacostia River, but this is all swampy. And so the British have to go north of the town, kind of northeast, and then advance down. And there'll be a battle here called Bladensburg, where the American militia met them. Bladensburg seemed like a good place to defend. In fact, Madison went out to watch, Secretary of State Monroe went out to watch the fun, watch the battle. Bladensburg had a stone fence all the way around the town, 4 to 5 feet high. So like the town was a fortification. So you get kind of this image of a stone fence. So militia didn't have to be in the open. They could get behind this fence, load relatively protected. At every opening, you put your cannon. Good place to defend. And the British commander, a general by the name of Ross, so they just simply went around. But instead, this had to be a fast operation. This is a raid. It's not a full offensive. And Ross had nothing but contempt for the Americans. So his plan was, like the British had done in the past, fire once, then do what? Yeah, and charge. And so, when the battle happened, the British marched at 50 yards from it. Fired once, fixed bayonets, and began a march. So behind this fence, the American militia came, and they did what? Ran away as fast as they could go. Just took off. It started with a few men. Next, all 5,000 took off running. Madison, I mean, literally watching this from a hill. Oh my God! He jumped on horse and he ran away. The British started chasing him. They couldn't catch him. The British would call this battle the Bladensburg Races. They chased him all the way into Washington, D.C. A lot of those men kept running. Some men supposedly jumped into the Potomac to try to escape over to Virginia. It was a rout of unprecedented proportions. Madison barely had enough time to get a few possessions out of the executive mansion, then run away. As he is leaving, the British are arriving. There were shots fired into the executive mansion. Then they, of course, looted the executive mansion. That's the executive mansion burning in the background. If you go to the executive mansion today, which we call the White House, they built it on the old foundation. And there are still bullet holes on the columns in the back of the White House. A couple little musket ball holes still in there from the British took it. And they advanced over to the Capitol. And that's them ripping off marble from the Capitol. They looted everything from it. There's a plaque about a block from the Capitol where it says, this is the spot where President Madison watched British troops enter the Capitol. It's a block away. You can see the Capitol, like, oh, he was close. And they went in and they just went nuts. Took everything, tearing things down, and things they couldn't take, what did they do? They braked it. They braked it and broke it. They braked it all. And they broke it and just went crazy. It just destroyed it all. And they're in the floor of the U.S. House chambers, and they're breaking stuff and stealing everything. And General Ross, the commander, battle-hardened from the Peninsular Campaign, started beating his pistol at the speaker's podium, the Speaker of the United States House. And he's beating it. No one looked, so he finally shot it in the air. And everyone stopped. They took it like a gavel and said, men, this is a parliament, so we'll have a vote. Shall we burn it? They're like, ah! And so they burned down the Capitol. And that is them marching away. You can see the loot they're all carrying. If you go to the United States Capitol today, they built it right on the old foundation. So in the basement, there are scorch marks in the foundation from when they burnt it in 1814. This is what we call humiliation. And then they left, and they went into a burned Capitol. The Capitol would not be fully finished until the late 1820s. Well, actually, partially finished. And they built a small rotunda And the rotunda that's on there now would not be finished until 1863 during the Civil War. That's how long it took. And then they moved up to Baltimore. Baltimore, once again, becoming an important trading city. The plan was burn it down, just burn it down. It's a raid. And they had a very similar plan. They would attack overland with troops, and they would bring a bombardment fleet to reduce, which means to knock out, a couple of the forts around Baltimore. And the most important fort was in the unfinished Fort McHenry. Got to get Fort McHenry. Right, this little finger of land, this little peninsula. Fort McHenry's right on this little finger, and the walls were not done. The bomb-proofs, shelters, they call them bomb-proofs then, were not completed, and so really didn't have much protection from plunging British shells. And the British bred gunboats. Gunboats are relatively small boats that carried mortars. Anybody know what a mortar is? Yeah. They were big, fat, actually relatively short howitzers. Yeah. And they fired straight up. The idea is to plunge down. Perfect against a fort that didn't have a roof. They also had rockets. Newfangled rockets. Now, imagine you know what a bottle rocket is? Yeah. Imagine a big bottle rocket. A stick with a barrel of gunpowder on it. And they put it in kind of basically a little V-shaped little ramp, and they just kind of drive it up and down, and it will up in the air, and it might hit, it might explode in the air. It was more spectacular. It was a heck of a fireworks show. And they had these rockets, and the plan was knock out this fort, knock them out. This was only a raid. Well, Francis Scott Key was a young lawyer. And he rowed out to the British main fleet, which is back here, to try to get the release of a friend of his that was captured during the attack on Washington. And he rowed out there, and basically they were going to release him. But he could not leave until the bombardment was done. And so he had a relatively close front row seat. Well, I shouldn't really wait a second, that doesn't make sense. More like a balcony seat. He's back far away from it, so what he sees is in the distance, a little peninsula, a tiny little fort, and he could see the bombardment ships. And the night before, he saw the McHenry flag that went down at night, and then dark. So we saw this spectacular explosion. And could you imagine what those big bottle rockets must have looked like? And then one more thing. The mortars were hollow, round cannonballs. And inside, they put gunpowder. And then they have a fuse. When they lit the mortar, the fuse would light, and hopefully they had the fuse at the exact right length. So as it went, the fuse would burn, and then explode when it landed. Sometimes it exploded within the mortar, or like a foot out. This was a very, very flawed way of doing it. So you could see the fuse through the air on these bombs. That's what they call them. They didn't have a percussion cap yet that they use now. They hit and they explode. They didn't have that. And so they attacked. And Francis Scott Key watched this. This is a shot looking back at, there's McHenry, there's a bombardment. See the little thing right there? That's the fuse. No, you could not see that, but they are imagining that's what they saw.
Could you see the little spark?
Yeah, you can see that. So like this little flame through the air, like a light through the air. But the rockets were spectacular. Just through the air. It's meant to explode. They'd be spiraling. And he watched it. He watched the bombardment, watched it throughout the night, but the assumption is nobody could survive this. Well, actually, it was relatively inaccurate. It didn't work at all. It was actually a half-hearted effort by the British. And in the morning, what did he see? That flag. They rose the flag up. Now you look at this. Souvenir hunters over the years in the 19th century cut out pieces to take home. Somebody cut out the star. So they have a big star. Somebody still has this star, but nobody wants to admit it. And then it went into an attic. Then eventually to the Smithsonian Museum of American History. Look how big that flag is. It's 3 stories high. This massive flag, he saw it. And part of the thing is it has to be that big because he's pretty far away. And he would be inspired to do what?
Write a song.
No, write a poem. The Star-Spangled Banner. Now, that's what Fort McHenry looks like today. If you get a chance to go to Baltimore, go to McHenry. McHenry is really cool. It's on this beautiful, it's in this beautiful park. And this is what the finished fort was going to look like. These ramparts were not completed. The main fort is inside, and it's masonry, but it would become a prison by the 1850s. During the Civil War, it was a prison. And that's what Francis Scott Key saw. Ironically, held in that prison for being pro-Confederacy was Francis Scott Key's grandson. Small world. But, no, it's really neat. The fort is really cool. It's just beautiful. The bay's overlooking this. And he wrote the Star-Spangled Banner. It's 4 stanzas of this poem. Now, he was a kind of a junior poet. What is that? But he had a song in his head. And so poems have rhythm, have meter. So he had a song when he wrote it down. And here's the first verse of it. That we only know the first verse. Nobody knows the 4. But if you look at it, it's a fighting song. And there are references to the battle. At dawn, seeing the flag. At twilight, we did see it before. The ramparts in front of the fort, they were unfinished. The rockets, red glare. The bombs. But in the morning, it was still there. It's beautiful. It is a good song, but it's a good fighting song. And it's not as bloody as the French national anthem that literally has blood running through the streets.
Yeah, it's like the nation will flow there.
But
Or something like that.
it was a poem. And the poem became popular by the 1820s and the big growth of nationalism after the war. And more they started singing it to the song that he picked. They tried it with other music, but it just seemed to fit. The problem is the song is really hard to sing on purpose. It was from the Anacreon Society. Anacreon. The Anacreon Society was a drinking society from England. They would sit around and get drunk and sing. And the idea was you have this piano, and they'd be playing this song, they'd be singing with it while drunk. So it's designed to have parts that are low and then to be screamed. You ever try to sing the national anthem seriously? During World War II, they started playing it during sporting events, and they still do it, kind of that legacy. Then we're not godless Congress, so we kept doing it. But people sing it, and most people just kind of unlikely sing it. You ever try to sing it seriously? Like in choir or anything? Or it's a hard song to sing.
Wait, so how we sing it now, the original, like, to
Mm-hmm. Well, he didn't want, but that's what he was thinking. Yeah, that's the drinking song. You notice how there's high parts? That's supposed to be screamed. And then back down. It's a really hard song to sing. That's because it's a drinking song. And more people started singing that and My Country 'Tis of Thee by the Civil War. Both of them, there's no national anthem per se. And My Country 'Tis of Thee was actually more popular, it's easier to sing. The problem was during World War I, if they played songs for the review of American soldiers at the end of the war, My Country 'Tis of Thee shares music with another song. Then it was God Save the King. Now it's God Save the Queen. Nobody knew who they were playing the music for. The U.S. or what country? Britain. Isn't that ironic? So we figured we better have a song that's not the British national anthem. Thus, the Star-Spangled Banner became the national anthem in 1931 because of that. So, Francis Scott Key wrote that. Since the fort survived, the British decided we've done what we wanted, and they pulled out, didn't take Baltimore. What a humiliating defeat. But while this is happening, this foolish war, and it was looking back at it, a foolish war, is winding down. In Ghent, Belgium, the Treaty of Ghent is being ratified. Now, I know a lot of you are thinking, wait a minute, aren't all treaties supposed to be in what city?
Paris.
But Napoleon had just surrendered, they didn't want it there. Yeah. We're coming to it. New Orleans hasn't happened yet. And if you go to Belgium, go to Ghent. Ghent is a cool town. And that's the first time I had Stroop waffles. Oh. You know what those are? Thin sugar wafers, a waffle flavor.
Oh, those are so good.
Yeah, and they're good for you.
Yeah.
It's like celery. At a farmer's market, I got a little thing about that big, and my wife went out to go do something. She had something else I was sitting in a park waiting for, and I was going to have one. I had 18. Dude, 18 of them. Like in a minute. Oh my God!
Have you ever tried them like on top of a piece that's just like melted?
We're not British.
No, they seriously do that and it melts the caramel. It's amazing.
That's a good advice. But they didn't need much help. This treaty was one of those status quo ante bellum. Remember this was, what does status quo ante bellum mean? Yeah. So nothing really changed. The treaty was signed on December 24th, 1814, and now it's got to go back to the United States and back to Britain to be ratified, but everybody wanted out of this foolish war. Everybody. But a couple things happened. First off, while they're negotiating, New England about broke away. It's called the Hartford Convention. And at the Hartford Convention, Federalists got together. So I have Federalists. I don't know why I put letters in there. They started making a list, and I just left it. Federalists. They met in secret in Hartford, Connecticut. And they started talking nullifying the war. Remember what nullification was? That goes back to the Virginia and Kentucky resolutions that Jefferson and Madison did. Ironic, Madison did this, and now the Federalists are doing it against him. But they talked about, we're going to nullify the war, and we might have to secede. The thing was, the war ended before anything could come out of this. And in the wave of nationalism after the war, the Federalists look like they don't care about the country. Unpatriotic. And that's the key thing. They look like they didn't care. The Hartford Convention really would hurt them. This is a Republican cartoon, and that's, you remember her name? Who's she? Not Liberty. Columbia, yep. Eagle. Beelzebub. The devil. Whose crown? Yeah, King George IV. Yeah, King George IV. Yeah. And so it made the Federalists look like they were unpatriotic. Because when the war ended, even though the United States did not win, they felt like they won. So let's get to the last thing. But before we get to that, remember one of the main reasons for the war was security along the frontier. Tecumseh, the Northern Confederacy, was destroyed. I'm sorry, Tippecanoe. Where was Tecumseh during the Battle of Tippecanoe? And the tribe was the Creeks. Yeah.
Oh, was it money under the?
Yeah, it's implying that the British were giving them money, tribute to join. They're patriotic. All they care about is money for their trade. The Creek War. The Creek War. Now, this is all leading up to New Orleans. Now, it's technically part of the War of 1812, but in reality, what it was is the United States is going to destroy now those southern tribes. The Creek, the Choctaw, the Chickasaw, and the Cherokee, but the Creek were the most powerful one. And Andrew Jackson would lead an American army of militia and some regular soldiers through what is now Alabama, then it was Mississippi Territory, basically trying to destroy the Creeks. And he succeeded. The battle was Horseshoe Bend. At Horseshoe Bend, Andrew Jackson and his forces routed the Creeks. Actually, the battle raged back and forth, but then a combination of bad luck by the Creeks and grape shot. Grape shot, just couldn't deal with it. Here's Jackson accepting the surrender of the Creeks, but the point is, the Creeks were destroyed. The southeastern tribes are completely destroyed after Horseshoe Bend. A lot of people argue what is more decisive, Horseshoe Bend or Tippecanoe. It is Tippecanoe, because Tecumseh was brilliant, and it ended him. But Horseshoe Bend kind of finished the job started at Tippecanoe. The tribes in the south are destroyed, and it's now they're all going to be moved. Yeah. Well, they didn't know. Tippecanoe we know now they were destroyed. But the idea was, well, they might do it. Maybe they can unify again, so we better knock them out now. And then Jackson marched to New Orleans, knowing that New Orleans, I can't almost say New Orleans, Nolens. I wanted to go there, and he knew the British were coming. And so what we're coming to is the Battle of New Orleans. The Battle of New Orleans. And New Orleans. Jackson is there, end of 1814, going into 1815. The British have an invasion force of troops from Spain, good troops, 10,000 of them, under a very fine general with the great name Edward Pakenham. Pakenham. They're waiting for hurricane season to end. So it's December when they begin sailing up to Louisiana. They had no idea the war was over when they landed and marched overland to attack New Orleans. Had no idea. So the war technically ended December 24th. The Battle of New Orleans will be January 8th, 1815. 2.5 weeks after. And the British plan was, it's too hard to go up the Mississippi. It was too many channels, too shallow, took too long. So their plan was to land east of it and march overland through swamps and get to the Mississippi River and attack there. And this map below shows basically what it looks like. Here are swamps. Here's the Mississippi River. New Orleans is back up this way. What Jackson had his men do, there was a canal right here. These are sugar plantations. And there are canals dug through to drain the water out of these sugar plantations. You want a low water, but not a swamp for sugar. So it was murky, just more than that, just kind of just a mud flat. Because it's winter, so there's not really sugar being grown on it. So just imagine just a little bit of water and mud, murk, all this area. What Jackson had his men do along this canal is dig an 8-foot berm, meaning they took dirt out, so they widened the canal and made a big mound. What a great place to defend, knowing that the British are going to attack right there. And that's the Battle of New Orleans. Jackson had his about 5,000 men from Tennessee and Kentucky, and then he had militia and pirates. The New Orleans Delta was, or the Mississippi Delta was a great hiding place for pirates. So there's all these pirates. And the British were trying to exterminate the pirates, so they joined Jackson. Jackson didn't care. He needed men. And so even though Jackson was outnumbered, he's in this great defensive location. And the British attacked, the plan was to attack here and a diversion here. Yeah.
How many troops did the British have?
The British had just over 10,000. You don't even know the exact numbers. The British had it slightly outnumbered. And the British plan was this. They waited. They marched just out of sight here. And they waited the night of the 7th. And they were going to attack just before the sun came up. The problem was it got below freezing, which it rarely does there. Can you imagine what that would have been like? What's the ground like? It's wet underneath, but it's got just below freezing.
So it's ice on top.
Thin layer of ice. And then murk underneath that's bitterly cold. So what's every step? And then the plan was to have the lead guys carry a 15-foot ladder. And the first guys would drop their ladder over that widened canal, and they would run across that ladder. Then the next guys with the ladder would put it over the berm, they'd climb over. Any volunteers to go carry the ladder? I just imagine those guys going, ah! They're trying to lose them, carrying this ladder. That was the plan. And immediately they begin to fall
So they
apart.
can't even shoot. They just like.
Oh yeah, they don't have they're just running with their ladder. These guys were supposed to attack this way. They got lost. And when they realized they were lost, they turned here. Can you imagine what happened? They're just slaughtered this way. They got to just a couple spots here and were mowed down. Actually, the diversion actually broke through a little bit, but at the end of the day, it was a slaughter for the British. This shows the battle, very stylistic woodcutting of it. You can see the main attack here, and Jackson's forces here. Here's another one I can't understand at all what happened. Something happened, and they're wearing red, but I put the numbers up. At the end of the day, over 2,000 British soldiers would be killed. Look how many Americans died.
Wow.
One of the men mortally wounded was Pakenham. Now here's the deal. Oh, okay. Pakenham, he was a general, a famous general, a hero. He was a knight. And his wife, because he's so important, his wife and children were actually on board ship in Lake Bourne waiting for him. You're part of the invasion fleet. He was mortally wounded. For regular British soldiers, they bury him where they lie. So they just buried him all over. Pakenham got sent home. How do you get a body home? Especially a body, how do you get home in 1815? Salt. Too valuable. Every ship had grog. What's grog? Some kind of alcoholic beverage that every sailor got 2 cups a day in their rations. This went all the way through World War II. That was like 2 cups a day. It was rum or whiskey or something. Relatively low alcohol, so it's watered down. They don't want them drunk, but that's what they gave them. 2 cups of grog. The U.S. Navy had this to the Civil War. Same deal. They do alcohol now. They ended that in World War II. U.S. Navy ended in 1862. So, imagine these barrels. Well, they had a barrel half full of rum, about 20% alcohol. And what did they do? They stuffed the body in there, nailed it shut. As legend goes, about halfway across the Atlantic, it was a hard trip, not good winds. They ran out of grog.
Oh.
When they arrived in Plymouth and opened the barrel, first off, there was a gray thing in there, and it got up and looked at him. And bone dry. All I'm saying is, some sailors got thirsty, and they weren't picky.
Would you have like eaten some of him though then too? Because like making competition with it and stuff?
Protein. So, because of the War of 1812, the Americans felt like we won the war. No, we didn't win. Our capital was burnt down and everything we tried was a disaster. But we felt like we won. And a wave of nationalism. We owe no allegiance. We owe allegiance to no crown. A very famous saying that came out of that. And the first time the American flag became used more and more. And a couple of these came out that solidified us as Americans. We survived. Next, Indian threat now is completely gone. Tippecanoe was that turning point moment. Horseshoe Bend finished it. Finished it. It's done. Next, hey, we made it. The U.S. is now independent and we're here to stay. Britain was hoping to break it up. No. And after this, the British just basically ignored the United States. We actually had some time of isolation, which was actually very good for the development of the country. Next, Federalist Party, dead. By 1820, the Federalist Party would be gone and would roll into the Republicans. Clearly, the same issues were there. Next, because there were no roads, it triggered this, it's almost a demand, a need for better transportation. And the transportation revolution goes hand in hand with something even bigger. Because of, it goes back to the embargo, the Non-Intercourse Act, Megan's Bill number 2, and then the blockade. The blockade especially. Americans couldn't get that wonderful British textile. This actually was this part cotton, part polyester. So they didn't have this yet, but polyester. It would trigger what would change the world. The Industrial Revolution. What the heck? Okay, so let's go back. The Battle of Lake Champlain. I might ask, the only thing I might say is I think on the test there might be a question where I mentioned McDonald. As long as you know they won, you're going to be okay. But it's just such a good story. At Lake Champlain, imagine a very narrow lake. So I'm drawing the lake. Do you feel like now you're in upstate New York? Do you feel it? How do we know this is water and this is land? How do we know?
Land walrus.
The land walrus, a chubby one, on the land. Right? Land walruses hate water. Is that because of the patrol on the coast? Okay. Let's say this real fast. Just watch. I know you're putting things away. Let's watch. McDonald had about 16 ships. I drove 5 of them. Oh, you want to see it real fast? Yeah. We will trade with anybody who respects our neutrality rights. I'll just tell you real fast. The guns are on both sides. So only half, it's called a broadside, only half of the ships can fire. It looks like a, what kind of, not a paramecium, but what are the ones with the little. But what they did is, each boat has anchors on the bow. They had them both put the anchor down. And then the current's going this way. So what they did is, this one they held tight. That one they let the chain loose. And what happened? The boat turned. And then they would lock it. So imagine now,
Oh, that is really fire.
so the boat is now turned, where it's kind of like this, with the anchor kind of wrapped out like this. And then what would they do? They'd fire on one side and then do what? Turn in the anchor, they let loose. They bring it in, and the boat would do what? Turn. It took about 5 minutes to load a cannon. So the British, every 5 minutes, how many times did the U.S. fire? 2. And they won the battle.
That is
Pretty ingenious, isn't it? Have a great day. The test, we get it going as quickly as possible. I know, I'm sorry about that. I totally misread that. I blame society. Where are you going to be? Where are you going to be? You're planning a convention? What convention? Oh, okay. We're starting the Industrial Revolution. I have some reading on science. Oh, I got to do it. I'll send it after the test. Now you guys.